What's up, everyone? Today we have a special episode dedicated to Pokemon's very own Xenomorph, the one and only Deoxys. It was formerly famed for its difficulty to obtain in its first few generations of existence, as it used to only be available from very rare events. It was one of the most sought after Pokemon amongst kids worldwide, myself included. Its various forms made it even cooler. That was a rarity back in the days of Generation 3, and in those games, its form depended on which game it was in. It couldn't be changed unless it was traded to another game, and that is yet another way they get you to buy the same game more than once. And it wasn't until the amazing Delta episode from Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire that Deoxys could be obtained without an event. It was there that the player atop Mega Rayquaza would burst into space and fight Deoxys there, in a legendary encounter that arguably has yet to be topped. Speaking of Rayquaza and Deoxys, the two also fought in Deoxys' own movie, Destiny Deoxys, in which it showed off its many forms, constantly changing shape like the original alien from 1979. It only adds to the terror. Today, we're going to be examining how all four forms performed in the competitive scene, and so we asked, how good was Deoxys actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Deoxys Normal is a hilariously dangerous Pokemon in its own right, with attack and special attack on par with Rayquaza, one of the highest speed stats in the game, and incredible offensive coverage. However, it was never ever seen in its debut generation of Ubers, because it was completely and utterly outclassed by Deoxys Attack. It was really that simple. If you had a choice between two offensive Deoxys forms, both of which were one-hit KO'd by a light breeze anyway, then you would choose the one that had base 180 attack and special attack instead of 150. As a result, Deoxys Normal was effectively an OU banlist Pokemon in the context of Gen 3 Ubers. It was never good enough to be used over Deoxys Attack, but it was far too broken to ever be allowed in OU. Some refer to the phenomenon as suffering from success. As for Deoxys Attack, it was absolutely incredible. It was ludicrously threatening to any and all teams. It was unquestionably the #1 offensive Pokemon in the tier, and one of the very best Pokemon in the tier, period. It required incredibly aggressive play to get in on the field safely, since it couldn't switch into any attacking move stronger than Fortress's Rapid Spin, but it was well worth the effort, because Deoxys A threatened quite literally everything in the game, both with its obscene power and with its nearly unmatched speed. The only faster Pokemon in the game were Deoxys Speed, which was okay but not much of an offensive threat, and meant the opponent wouldn't have a Deoxys Attack of their own, and the incredibly gimmicky Ninjask. The only way one would reliably outspeed Deoxys A without requiring a turn to set up was with the decent but rare Swift Swim Omastar while rain was up. Otherwise, there was no way of even matching its speed, barring risking a speed tie with one's own Deoxys A, and you could forget about actually outspeeding it. Even Mewtwo, one of the tier's fastest Pokemon, was easily outrun by Deoxys A, and Deoxys A didn't even need to use a plus speed nature to do it. Not only was Deoxys A mind-bogglingly powerful, it possessed a diverse array of equally dangerous sets that made it even more difficult to answer. Its go-to set was the Choice Band variant, which possessed a monstrously powerful superpower. It was incredibly easy to spam since the tier's fighting resist, most popularly the Laddie twins, were utterly destroyed by Shadow Ball. The two moves formed perfect neutral coverage, which was all Deoxys needed given its unmatched strength. Deoxys also had another incredible move on its Choice Band set, the strongest priority in the game, Extreme Speed. It didn't spam the move regularly since it was so incredibly fast naturally, but it was an amazing move to have against occasional Pokemon that would challenge its speed, such as Substitute Salakberry, Groudon, and Kyogre, opposing extreme speeds from the likes of its mortal enemy Rayquaza, and of course, other Deoxys Attack. Choice Band Deoxys A was so vicious with these three moves that it could have just used them and still be the tier's defining offensive threat, but it of course had a fourth move slot, which made it even more difficult to stop. Even more impressively, this fourth move was usually a special attack because Deoxys A was so ridiculously strong that it could use an uninvested special attack on a banned set and still succeed. It most commonly used Fire Punch, which when backed by Groudon's Eternal Sun, would absolutely fry Metagross, who was the most popular check to banded Deoxys A for its bulk, typing, and ability to trap it with Pursuit. A sun-boosted Fire Blast would also lay waste to other makeshift would-be checks in Fortress, Full Health Heracross, and Skarmory. There was usually little risk in Kyogre switching in against Deoxys to change the weather, as Ogre was deathly afraid of banded superpower. There were other options too. Rain teams often used Thunder or Ice Beam in that slot, and Rock Slide was an option option as well to destroy unsuspecting Ho-Oh. However, no matter which, Deoxys A was permanently threatening to every single team. You couldn't safely wall it, and you couldn't exactly out-offense such an incredibly fast Pokemon when there's no Choice Scarf and almost no priority. Of course, despite its unmatched potential to drop everything in the game, Choice Band could be a bit prediction reliant and thus potentially inconsistent. As a result, several players simply changed the item to Spell Tag, keeping the set the same, most commonly with Fire Punch on Sun Team. While the lack of a boost on Superpower was sometimes annoying against Groudon and Kyogre, Deoxys still hit them incredibly hard, especially when supported by spikes, as it often was. Its Shadow Ball targets were still stung quite hard, especially with Spell Tag's slight but significant extra sting. This Deoxys set didn't need a huge power boost in order to tick, even though it never used stab moves. What made it so effective was the fact that in addition to its ludicrous strength, it now also had the element of surprise. It was already difficult enough to handle when you knew exactly what it was going to do, but when you didn't even have that, it became utterly ridiculous. Metagross and Fortress would think that Deoxys was choice locked into one of his physical moves and would then get absolutely destroyed by Fire Punch. It wasn't fully reliant on the element of surprise either. Deoxys would still threaten the opposing team like nothing else once the set had been revealed, as its ability to switch between moves perfectly complemented its power. Speaking of Deoxys A sets that switched attacks, while Choice Band was the best Wall Breaker and Revenge Killer in Ubers, its sub-Pataya variant was the tier's best sweeper and completely turned the tables on would-be checks. Groudon was decked by an invested Ice Beam, and Kyogre was fried by Thunder. The combination of these two provided perfect neutral coverage on the special side, barring Magneton, who was smashed by Deoxys' fourth move, Superpower, and the incredibly gimmicky Shedinja, which died to the spikes Deoxys Attack liked so much anyway. This two-move neutral coverage was important, since 1, it allowed Deoxys A to KO as much as possible once it activated its Pataya Berry, and 2, it allowed it to run Superpower in the last slot, ensuring that Blissey was unable to wall it. Late game, it was common for Deoxys to sub down to its Pataya Berry, then outspeed and one-hit KO the entire remainder of the opponent's team. With its perfect blend of speed, power, move flexibility, and super effective coverage, it was the ultimate sweeper in a tier full of seemingly ultimate sweepers. Of course, Deoxys didn't need to sub down to a Pataya boost to be effective, as it was immensely threatening right off the bat, especially since Ice Beam retained its crucial super effective hit on the Lati twins. It often softened teams up for its own sweep later on. It wasn't even beholden to running Choice Band, Spell Tag, or sub Pataya. It could mix and match its offensive options as it pleased, such as running Extreme Speed or Fire Punch over Substitute on the Pataya set, and exchanging the Pataya for another, more immediate offensive boosting item like Never Melt Ice. Deoxys Attack was the single most effective offensive Pokemon in a metagame famed for its astonishing levels of offensive output, and thus it defined much of the tier. Though it didn't match its offensive counterpart's level of metagame influence, the opposite side of the Deoxys coin was also thoroughly unique in the place it occupied in the tier, and it was absolutely excellent. Deoxys Defense was a foreboding defensive presence between its enormous bulk, neutrality to most common attacks, and reliable healing with Recover, which packed a whopping 32 PP in advance. Thanks to pressure, Deoxys Defense was effective at quickly depleting the PP of several of the common offensive moves it could switch into: Ice Beam, Thunder, and especially Superpower. However, Deoxys Defense wasn't just the wall. Its utility move pool was what made it so excellent, allowing it to utilize the many free turns it was afforded by virtue of its auspicious defensive profile in order to harass the opponent in a variety of equally irritating ways. The first of its many obnoxious tools was Knockoff, which was utterly devastating for whatever Pokemon switched into. No bulky Pokemon liked losing its leftovers. Offensive Pokemon didn't care to lose their berries or choice bands, and most of all, the Lati twins were utterly terrified of losing their Soul Dew. Nothing would neuter them harder, and in this sense, Deoxys Defense threatened them like no other Pokemon in Ubers could, especially because it was great at sponging their hits. Deoxys Defense's Knockoff was one of the most effective offensive weapons in the tier, unless one both had a choice band Heracross and managed to never once allow Deoxys Defense a free turn. It was impossible to stop Deoxys from using the move, and the move would be effective no matter what switched in. In a similar vein, Deoxys Defense was also a phenomenal user of spikes. Its reliable defensive presence allowed it to stack multiple layers throughout a match, and Knockoff's leftovers removal amplified Spike's effects further. Deoxys Defense also had a major advantage over other popular spikers, Fortress, and Skarmory, in that it was completely unafraid of being trapped by Magneton. Deoxys Defense could also easily prevent attempts at healing off all this passive damage thanks to Taunt. With these moves, it absolutely destroyed bulkier Pokemon and teams who often could not damage it at all, and Taunt blocked the lights of Toxic as well. If paired with another spiker, Deoxys Defense could drop spikes and use Toxic of its own, making it able to cripple Groudon and Kyogre much more effectively. Being able to dish out so much damage while being so apt defensively made Deoxys Defense a fantastic Pokemon for various types of bulkier teams. In addition to being a solid answer to the Laddies, it completely shut down many variants of Mewtwo, and unlike Blissey, Deoxys Defense didn't come close to being KO'd by self-destruct. The move needed absolute max damage to even break 80%, and so Deoxys Defense was a tremendous, often underrated gem in advanced Ubers. Deoxys Speed's extra speed over the attack form wasn't enough to give it a niche as an offensive Pokemon, since it didn't hit hard at all. It also didn't possess anywhere near the type of bulk the defense form did. However, it did have one specific but legitimately good niche. Deoxys Speed was the advanced Uber's premier offensive lead spiker. Now you might wonder, why not use Deoxys Attack in such a role? Since in addition to spiking, it could also threaten huge damage on the opponent? Simple. Deoxys Attack would crumple to every attack in the game, even if you were insane enough to give it maximum bulk investment. Deoxys Speed wasn't bulky, but with investment, and it could afford to invest almost entirely in bulk since it was so naturally fast. It was bulky enough to live one big hit, such as Kyogre's Surf or Groudon's Earthquake, and this made a world of difference in allowing it to mess with the opponent as much as possible and set the stage optimally for its hard-hitting teammates. One layer of spikes was not worth sacrificing a Pokemon over, but starting a game with a layer of spikes and a knockoff on one of the opponent's Pokemon very well could be, and that was enough of a concrete exploitable advantage to make it worth starting down 5-6, as it would more effectively jumpstart Deoxys Speed teammates' snowball effect. Alternatively, Deoxys could go for 2 layers, which weren't a huge improvement on 1 layer, but could be effective since every percent counted when you were dealing with monsters as strong as the ones in advanced Ubers. Deoxys could even get 1 layer and switch out and come back later. At the very worst, it would provide useful death fodder, which could be crucial to preserve the health of its important teammates. At best, it could do so while getting another layer or knocking something off, or even get the 2nd and 3rd layer, since it could easily take advantage of bulky Pokemon like Blissey. It wouldn't be hard to double switch in either, since Latios absolutely required Blissey to come in. Some players even took advantage of Deoxys Speed's ability to shut down bulky Pokemon like Blissey by using Recover in the last slot, imitating Deoxys Defense. Bulky teams wouldn't be able to easily spin Deoxys Speed's spikes either, since it packed Fire Punch for Fortress, and sometimes came equipped with Gengar as a teammate to ensure the spikes remained. Other teams liked Mirror Coat on a Deoxys Speed lead, which could completely turn the tables on special attacking leads like Kyogre and Latios. Being able to take out a Pokemon and still get its spikes up was excellent. Overall, Deoxys Speed's niche was specific but excellent, and as such, the Deoxys forms as a whole were amongst the most defining pieces of the Gen 3 Ubers metagame. The bad news, spoiler alert, after Generation 4, Deoxys Normal would never be seen in Ubers again. The good news in Generation 4 Ubers, it had a small but genuinely good role by virtue of its extra bulk over Deoxys Attack. It was not actually bulky by any stretch of the imagination, but just like Deoxys Speed where it used its just good enough bulk to carve out a niche for itself in Gen 3 Ubers, so too did Deoxys Normal in Generation 4. Deoxys Normal's niche was based upon the following premise. Deoxys Speed was the lead in Gen 4 Ubers. Everything revolved around it. Mirror matches between 2 Deoxys Speed were quite messy. Deoxys Attack was an excellent lead in its own right, but it had the flaw of losing to the standard Deoxys Speed set, which would easily 2-hit KO Deoxys Attack with Extreme Speed. This is where Deoxys Normal came in. With some defense investment, it could do what Deoxys Attack couldn't and survive these 2 Extreme Speeds, allowing it to take Deoxys Speed out with Shadow Ball and its own Extreme Speed, ensuring that Deoxys Speed would never get more than 1 layer of entry hazard. Deoxys Normal was far better at this role than a specialized form of Deoxys Speed because of its significantly higher attacking stats. Deoxys Speed's Shadow Ball was far too weak to even come close to putting bulky variants of opposing Deoxys Speed in Extreme Speed range. Deoxys Normal was still highly useful in non-Deoxys Speed lead matchups because it could set up Stealth Rock and Spikes, setting the stage for its offensively minded teammates, just like Deoxys Speed. Essentially, Deoxys Normal played like a Deoxys Speed that had an advantage against other Deoxys Speed. Being able to beat Deoxys Speed was enough to give nearly anything a niche in the Gen 4 Ubers lead metagame. Ariados was a testament to that, but being able to beat Deoxys Speed while also effectively being Deoxys Speed, now that was effective as it was unique. Deoxys Normal was no gimmick. It saw significant tournament usage and success, and was a legitimate part of the Gen 4 Ubers lead metagame. Deoxys Attack was also a major part of the Generation 4 lead metagame. Diamond and Pro's addition of Focus Sash ensured that despite Deoxys Attack's frailty, it would always survive one hit from from full health, which was a huge boon for it, giving it 2 turns with which it could wreak havoc on the opponent. Whereas its speed counterpart dedicated itself to laying hazards, Deoxys Attack bludgeoned the opponent from turn 1. Grass Knot, Guillotine, Groudon, and Kyogre, Superpower Slam Dialga and Darkrai, Shadow Ball shattered Deoxys Speed, especially non-Sash variants, and even Sash Deoxys Speed couldn't both KO Deoxys Attack with 2 Extreme Speeds and get a hazard up. Plus, eventually Deoxys Speed started dropping Extreme Speed altogether. Shadow Ball also shellacked Mew and Giratina Origin. Extreme Speed topped everything off beautifully, providing potentially crucial chip damage against the many Choice Scarfers tasked with revenge killing it. Deoxys Attack's sheer power was completed perfectly by its many coverage options, making it even more dangerous. For example, Deoxys Attack variants couldn't touch Fortress, but all it took was the addition of Fire Punch for the Deoxys Attack user to completely turn that matchup on its head, as well as catch cocky Scizor trying to pursue or U-turn. It was a similar story with the growingly popular Tentacruel lead, who started running Lumberry for Darkrai, only to get obliterated by Deoxys Attack's Psycho Boost, a move which also let it beat Rayquaza leads and was also massively threatening to Groudon and Kyogre. Spikes weren't Deoxys Attack's main focus, but it could sometimes incorporate them into its moveset to great effect. When facing an opponent that would run away from Deoxys Attack, as many Pokemon did, Deoxys Attack could throw down spikes and accomplish something for its team no matter what switched in. It allowed itself to somewhat bypass its occasional 4 move slot syndrome this way. Plus, it was still plenty threatening with just 3 moves, especially since they were highly customizable depending on its team. It could go with Stealth Rock as its hazard of choice, but only did so rarely. Spikes were more of a bonus when using Deoxys Attack, as you could afford to go without them if the situation called for it to attack the opponent instead, thus rendering it unable to set them up. You didn't want to have this situation with your Stealth Rocker. As a common threat, players of course attempted to prepare for Deoxys Attack, but the nature of Uber Pokemon tends to be that they have the versatility to make this an immensely difficult task, or their strength will just overwhelm you anyway. Deoxys Attack perfectly exemplified this concept, and reliably started off the slugfest for its fellow residents of Louisville, teammates. Deoxys Attack was more than just a lead though. Though rarer, it also had a place on highly offensive teams as a mid-game attacker. Hazards would be up, so a Focus Sash would be rendered useless, but Deoxys Attack didn't even mind, because it could just use another amazing 4th generation item seemingly tailor-made for it, Life Orb, whose recoil hardly mattered since Deoxys Attack was KO'd by everything anyway, and whose power boost was absolutely stunning. Life Orb Deoxys Attack played similarly to Mewtwo, with some key differences. Mewtwo packed self-destruct and was capable of surviving the strong priority commonplace in Ubers, Giratina O's Shadow Sneak, Scizor's Bullet Punch, and Lucario and Rayquaza's Extreme Speed, even if it wasn't in perfect health, such as after it had taken Stealth Rock and Life Orb recoil. However, Deoxys Attack was far from outclassed. It had its own distinct advantages. The most notable was the stark difference in power between the 2 psychic types. Deoxys Attack was so strong that it made Mewtwo's astonishing base 147 special attack look like nothing in comparison. While they could barely tank Mewtwo from high health, Groudon, Giratina Origin, and the Latias twins were absolutely wiped out by Deoxys Attack's Ice Beams, while Kyogre was absolutely thrashed by Thunder. DOA also had the benefit of significantly higher speed. In fact, it was so fast that it often ran a special attacking boosting nature, further highlighting the difference in power between the 2. It could afford to do this because it wouldn't really miss out on much, as it still outpaced the next fastest thing, Mewtwo, whereas Mewtwo was forced to run a speed boosting nature, or it would be outrun by Darkrai and Shaman Sky. However, speed boosting Deoxys Attack still had to be respected. In fact, it was a significant reason why Scarf Kyogre and Dialga ran speed boosting natures as opposed to special attack boosting natures they would otherwise prefer. DOA's huge attack was another major wall breaking benefit. Its powerful superpower powered through Dialga and Heatran far more effectively than Mewtwo's Aura Sphere, and ensured it destroyed Blissey without setting up, while Life Orb Extreme Speed ensured that Scarf Palkia and Kyogre could only check it while at high health. It was even easier to bring DOA onto the field despite its frailty, now thanks to the addition of U-turn. As such, teammates like Scizor and Jirachi allowed DOA to reliably circumvent its biggest weakness. Overall, Deoxys Attack was an absolute terror in Generation 4 Ubers. Deoxys Defense was not completely unviable in Gen 4 Ubers, but it was rarely seen because it was quite difficult to utilize effectively. Its neutrality to common moves that had worked well in advance did not translate well to Generation 4, which had Choice Specs and Life Orb around every corner, and thus required resistances to the moves with enormous base power coming off enormous attacking stats being boosted even further. Even Blissey couldn't always get by on sheer neutral bulk anymore. The metagame simply moved at too fast a pace for DOD. Knockoff could be annoying as always, but its impact was largely diminished in the kill every turn environment of Gen 4 Ubers. Even DOD's access to spikes wasn't enough. It lacked the dragon resistance that made Skarmory and Fortress so effective. Deoxys Defense couldn't even take take on a role as a stall breaker with taunt and recover, as that was outclassed by Mewtwo, who had gained Will-O-Wisp in Generation 4 and whose vastly higher speed made it far better against the popular offensive item. Deoxys Defense was never consistently comfortable at switching in and actually exerting some sort of offensive pressure on the opponent like in Gen 3. Its lack of resistances in this power creep metagame meant it was always on the back foot, which is the most exploitable thing ever for good players using offensive teams. DOD definitely had potential and some players explored the interesting possibilities it brought, but it never had any sort of genuine impact on the tier. And it's hard to do that when you have to recover as soon as you switch into an attack lest you die immediately, and that just gives a free turn to choice ban Scizor. Now before we get to how Deoxys Speed completely defined Generation 4 Ubers, we must first explore its adventures in OU. Yes, in Diamond and Pearl, Deoxys Speed was OU for some time, incidentally alongside another defining Pokemon that would eventually join it in the tier above, Garchomp. While Deoxys Speed's offensive capabilities were unimpressive at best in Ubers, its power was just fine by OU standards, considering it had incredible super effective coverage and could power itself up through items. It quickly became one of OU's most defining offensive threats, and many top players thought it completely invalidated offensive teams. It was so fast, it outran the vast majority of choice scarfers. You would have to revenge kill Deoxys Speed on an offensive team, since you certainly wouldn't be walling it, meaning it probably got a KO before you even had a chance to force it out. And to make matters worse, revenge killing opponents were severely limited. For choice scarfers, you were limited to Infernape, Gengar, and Azel, who were as rare in OU play as that list of options was short. Priority moves would get the job done after Stealth Rocks and a few rounds of Life Orb Recoil or a superpowered defense drought, but this was unreliable. Also, this was pre-platinum, meaning no Bullet Punch Scizor yet. Many offensive teams wound up relying on winning a speed tie with their own Deoxys Speed. Some players began using Expert Belt as the item on Deoxys Speed, making it even more difficult to deal with by removing Life Orb switch stalling from the equation, meaning it stayed out of priority range even more easily, while still providing the crucial boost to its many super effective attacks. Though it was this offensive set that completely shaped the metagame, DOS was also an incredible lead. It was impossible to stop its Stealth Rock early game, unless you got lucky and managed to taunt it by winning a speed tie with your own DOS. After getting up rocks, DOS would support its team even further with nigh unstoppable spikes or dual screens, making the offensive monsters on its team like Swords Dance, Garchomp, Lucario, and Infernape even more ludicrously dangerous. No matter what it did, DOS was completely overwhelming, warping the metagame around it. As such, it was banned from OU before Platinum's release. Deoxys Speed's lead Stealth Rock Spike set was one of Generation 4 Uber's most defining aspects since day one. Perhaps the most defining outright. Its influence could be argued to shape the tier more than Kyogre's Rain and Choice Specs boosted Water Spout, or all the Draco Meteors in the world. There was nothing more terrifying than giving DOS rocks and Alera spikes, than having to switch into several of Uber's most absurdly dangerous Pokemon. The offensive pressure and momentum these Pokemon supported by immediate multiple hazards, whether through sheer power or Darkrai Dark Void, was enough in and of itself to make rapid spinning a difficult task. But then Platinum came around and added Giratina Origin, making spinning nearly impossible. The old adage went like this: the leads in Gen 4 Ubers are Deoxys Speed and leads that beat Deoxys Speed. Alternatively, if your lead allowed Deoxys Speed to get up uncontested rocks and spikes uncontested in the first 2 turns, it was a bad lead. Same concept. Of course, part of what made DOS so great is its versatility. It had a ton of options to mess with the opponent, and by constantly adapting and continuously succeeding even when everyone prepared for it. Leads with a priority move such as Rayquaza and Giratina Origin were popular as they would bypass DOS's speed and limit it to one layer of hazards. This was effective, especially since these leads were difficult to switch into safely, and they could blast switch-ins thinking they could absorb a priority move. For example, Dialga could come into Extreme Speed or Shadow Sneak, but it wouldn't enjoy taking a Draco Meteor. However, this type of prediction went both ways, and these attacking leads often felt pressured to use their priority move on the second turn, lest they give DOS a second layer of hazards and thus not even do what they were supposed to do. As a result, DOS often successfully switched out on the second turn, with the switch in taking minimal damage. Thus, DOS was able to maintain early momentum while preserving itself for crucial death fodder later, or potentially even a layer of spikes if it managed to come in on a well-timed double switch. Funnily enough, one of the most reliable leads for thwarting Deoxys S was another variant of Deoxys S, especially the Scarf variant, showing DOS's ability to adapt. Choice Scarf Deoxys Speed might sound like a joke, but it wasn't used for outrunning a Groudon that had Rock Polish twice or something silly like that. With the Scarf, it would outrun opposing DOS and would thus be able to successfully use Trick before it got taunted. This would completely ruin the opposing DOS. It would be forced to switch out without having laid down hazards, while the formerly Scarf DOS could switch to a self-rocking teammate like Groudon and gain the hazard advantage. Plus, when the newly Scarf DOS DOS came back in, it wouldn't be able to switch moves, meaning it would only be able to get up rocks or spikes. If the opposing DOS used Stealth Rock as the Scarf DOS used Trick, as it sometimes did in Fear of Trick once Scarf DOS became more popular, then that was fine too. The opposing DOS would be forced to switch out only having gotten rocks, and the formerly Scarf DOS could begin using spikes itself. It'd get 2 layers before switching out if the opponent's response was Giratina Origin or Scizor and thus pack priority. But otherwise, it was probably getting all 3 spikes down thanks to its huge Scarfer outrunning speed and the focus sash it had taken from the opposing Deoxys S. Trick Scarf DOS was an excellent set, another testament to DOS's nearly boundless versatility and featured on many of the most successful teams in the metagame. DOS adapted in many different ways besides just its Scarf set. Choice Scarf Darkrai was considered the only true method of actually preventing DOS from setting up on the first turn at all, thanks to its huge speed and Dark Void. But eventually DOS started running Lumberry to shrug off the Dark Void, and it got up rocks as planned. It made up for the lack of a focus sash by investing EVs in special defense, which allowed it to take both Scarf Darkrai's Dark Pulse and Sash Rayquaza's Draco Meteor. Another popular anti-DOS lead was Tyranitar, whose Sandstorm would finish DOS off after Tyranitar's Crunch brought it to its sash. But once again, DOS adapted, this time by weakening Crunch through Cobra Berry. This allowed DOS to either get up both rocks and spikes, or to get rocks and then bring T-Tar down to 1 HP with Superpower, depending on its team. If the T-Tar was a Lum variant instead of Sash, DOS would even KO it, turning the tables completely. Cobra was also helpful in giving the DOS user extra play in numerous situations against Darkrai. Some players denied DOS's hazards by leading off with a Rapid Spin user that could force taunts by threatening its own hazards, wear DOS down, and spam Rapid Spin to prevent DOS from keeping hazards up. At first it was Fortress, then Tentacruel rose in popularity. A few players even used Armaldo, which was gimmicky, but such was the power of DOS, sending players plundering the depths of NU in desperate search for an answer. These Pokemon could potentially be irritating, but DOS could still deal with them. It could choose a coverage move for surprise KOs, either Hidden Power Firing Fortress or Psycho Boosting Tentacruel. It didn't even need to do this though. It could still play around them just with its standard set. It could switch to a teammate, force these Pokemon out, then double switch back in and get its rocks up uncontested, allowing Giratina Origin to have a hazard to spin block, rinse and repeat with spikes. Even though DOS was meant to play in an immediate rapid fire fashion, it would play with a more methodical approach as well. It could really just do whatever it wanted in the lead slot, including relegating Stealth Rock elsewhere and focusing solely on stacking as many layers of spikes as possible, even on non-Scarf sets. In addition to making its team more efficient in getting up hazards, this allowed it another coverage move, further improving its matchup spread. DOS wasn't much of a non-lead, as it wasn't at all as threatening an offensive Pokemon. Some players utilize a lead set outside the lead slot in order to more effectively get hazards up. It was more easily able to do this because it wouldn't be facing a Pokemon specialized to beat it, giving it an edge, and was able to switch in easily despite its lack of defensive utility by pairing with Scarf Darkrai, who would easily sleep the opposing lead. Though the strategy was effective, it was quite specific and thus wasn't too common. However, just like Azelf and OU, there was nothing wrong with being the best lead around. Sure, DOS could backfire if played mindlessly, but if its user utilized it well by taking into consideration its moveset and various lead matchups in conjunction with its teammates, the sky was the limit. By being the tier's single most defining lead, which the entire metagame revolved around, Deoxys Speed was one of the most important Pokemon in Generation 4 Ubers. And as a whole, the 4th generation was another successful one for the Deoxys forms. It can best be summarized by the Ubers lead metagame often being a Deoxys war in one form or another. The first stage of Generation 5 OU involved testing a bunch of former Ubers. This included, among others, every form of Deoxys. The metagame was chaotic to say the least. There were so many absurdly broken things running around that it was difficult to figure out where to start. Not many people actually used Deoxys Normal because it was just outclassed by Deoxys Attack. But if it had been allowed to remain in the tier after DOA's inevitable ban, it would have just done the same thing. So the player base saved themselves some time and banned it immediately. DON thus earned the unique distinction of being temporarily OU and being too good for the tier, despite not seeing any use. So that was something to tide it over as it returned to its advanced status of seeing no usage in Ubers. It couldn't reprise its anti-Deoxys Speed niche, as the old Extreme Speed DOS set from Generation 4 had completely died out. Predictably, Deoxys Attack tore through OU like butter. It outsped the Shaman Sky and Darkrai that everyone else was fawning over, and was just about impossible to switch into. Even the popular bulky Jirachi on rain teams didn't enjoy eating Life Orb Thunders powers or superpowers. Switching it in was easier than ever before, since Generation 5 not only gained excellent new U-turn Pokemon, but also added Volt Switch. Shocking as it may seem, Deoxys Attack was instantly banned from OU, and went on to shine in Ubers once again. The addition of Team Preview actually improved it in its role as a Focus Sash lead, whether it was using 4 attacks or 3 attacks with spikes. Now, if it saw the opponent was packing something that would ruin it like Tyranitar, it could simply not lead off, or it could lead off and make a more informed decision on which move needed to be made with regards to spiking versus attacking. For instance, superpowering the Tyranitar down to the Sash to give its teammate Groudon or Kyogre an almost guaranteed win in the Weather War. Having information on the opposing team helped players get the most out of DOA, who was already amazingly consistent. It didn't have to play guessing games as a result of only being able to run 4 moves anymore. It was a fixture on hyper offense styles. Beyond the land of leadoffs and Focus Sashes, Mewtwo had gained everyone's attention upon receiving Psy Strike, and thus DOA's Life Orb set was once again somewhat of an underrated gem, because it was uncommon relative to how devastating it could be. It was easier to provide switch-ins for it than ever before, thanks to pivoting teammates like Volt Switch Zekrom, and come Black and White 2, the new king of the tier, Scarf Genesect. Plus, one of Mewtwo's advantages over DOA, Self-Destruct, was no longer relevant as a result of the move's power nerf. Of course, Mewtwo still possessed the significant advantage of Fire Blast, but if it really needed, DOA could run Hidden Power Fire to great effect, and it had its own huge advantages Mewtwo would do anything for. In addition to superpower slamming Dialga, DOA's absurdly powerful Psycho Boost absolutely destroyed Ghost Arceus, with a good chance to cleanly KO it after Stealth Rock, while absolutely destroying Genesect thinking they could pivot in. If it didn't outright KO Genesect, it could seal the deal with another advantage of DOA's Extreme Speed, a move that also possessed great utility in finishing off weakened Extreme Killer Arceus. DOA's huge special attack advantage over Mewtwo was also huge in helping it blast through other popular bulky Pokemon like Ho-Oh, Lugia, Latias, and Giratina. Overall, Generation 5 Deoxys Attack was basically an enhanced version of its role in the previous generation. Team Preview helped it to be a better Sash lead, and new pivot moves helped its Life Orb set wreak havoc as much as possible. If you can believe it, Deoxys Defense did not start the 5th generation in OU, because it was too busy dropping to UU. As comical as this may seem, and it really was absurd, it wasn't quite as outrageous as it sounds, at least at first. Power creep was so excessive that nobody was really thinking about DLD, while Kyurem, Staraptor, and Sunfield Victini were in the tier. Even after the most immediately broken things left the tier, it took a while for DLD to really catch on. Everybody knew it was good, that much was obvious, and there was little more irritating than an Eviolite Chansey backed by Deoxys Defense. And if that sounds obnoxious, A, it's because it was, and B, just imagine having to play against it. However, it wasn't overshadowing the dominant strategies that rose in usage after the early stages of UU, such as Stoutland Sand. It would take some time, but it eventually turned out that it was not as a wall that DLD was at its best. Only once it began to see usage as an aggressive hazard stacker on offensive teams did the player base realize that one of the most dangerous Pokemon in the tier had been under their noses all this time. In other words, Deoxys Defense wasn't as good as Deoxys Defense offense. It was so effective because it was still massively bulky even with just maximum HP investment, and when it maxed its speed, it became unfairly easy for DLD to stack its own hazards while preventing the opponents. Answering it, or at least answering it reliably, was nearly impossible. Rapid spinning away the hazards wasn't an answer for multiple reasons. First, there were several excellent offensive ghosts available. Second, even if the ghosts themselves fell to the rapid spinner, they'd have denied the spinner so hard that it would be easy to finish it off with a teammate before spin could be used. For example, Chandelure wasn't perfect against Blastoise, but it could tank a Scald and slam it with Energy Ball, easily leaving the slow Blastoise in range to be KO'd by everything else on Chandelure's team. Third, DLD could choose to destroy most spinners itself between Rocky Helmet and Nightshade. Attempts to spin on DLD would be punished incredibly hard in just one turn, let alone the complete futility of a prolonged attempt. It was nearly impossible to stop DLD from setting up to begin with. Either faster taunts didn't really exist, and DLD could even run the newly buffed Magic Coat or Mental Herb if it wanted to bypass them, though its main use was getting the 1-up on opposing fast DLD in what would otherwise be a speed tie. Thus, most of the time, DLD would stack its hazards uncontested, and the spinners would take hazard damage as they switched into DLD's offensive teammates, making it even more impossible for them to actually get the spin off. With multiple hazards so easily stacked, several of UU's most dangerous offensive threats became ridiculously hard to switch into, especially in conjunction with one another. Some players wanted Spikes banned as a whole, since Roserade was another one of UU's most dominant Pokemon that consistently made his teammates ridiculously dangerous. However, the player base eventually decided that Deoxys Defense was the culprit, and chose to take action against it instead. Roserade remains a piece of Generation 5 UU to this day, while DLD, though it took longer than one would expect from a Deoxys form that somehow wound up in UU, was finally banned. Deoxys Defense didn't didn't take long to go from BL to a genuine OU Pokemon, as it had already established itself as the new face of the hyper offense playstyles immediately in the wake of Deoxys Speed's ban in Black and White 1. The same max HP, max speed dual hazard set from UU was similarly incredible in the tier above, starting the game with momentum and effectively powering up OU's most dangerous sweepers like Dragonite and Terrakion even more. It also didn't take long for the complaints about DLD to start rolling in. Its ease and nigh unstoppable hazard stacking, while concurrently preventing opposing hazards, was considered by many to be broken and unreasonably difficult to deal with, for the same reasons as Deoxys Speed. In many ways, DLD was even harder to deal with as a result of its monstrous bulk, allowing it to tank hits like non-banded Tyranitar's Crunch without having to dedicate its item to it. Speaking of its item, though the standard Rocky Helmet set was ridiculous enough, DLD could actually go on the offensive, threatening to actually KO several Pokemon commonly used against it. It wouldn't expect Deoxys Defense to be capable of dishing out actual offense, but it had several versatile tools to turn the tables and make itself even more of an issue. DLD was too difficult to KO, so most anti-Deoxys Defense options revolved around Rapid Spin. But as if Rocky Helmet and Nightshade alongside Gengar spin blocking wasn't enough, DLD could threaten to actually immediately KO the spinners, freeing it from the need to run spin blocking support. It could run Electric Gem Thunder to destroy the immensely popular bulky Starmie and put huge pressure on Tentacruel, or it could run Life Orb and range between Psycho Boost, Hidden Power Fire, and Super Power to smash Tentacruel, Fortress, and Choice Band Tyranitar respectively. DLD managed to survive in the tier longer than it probably should have been allowed to. Not until well into Black and White 2 was it suspected and at long last banned. Deoxys Defense's Generation 5 continued in Ubers. Its best quality was its ability to act as a nearly perfect counter to Psycho Killer Mewtwo, while easily laying down the spikes that defined the tier and shutting down opposing bulky spikers with taunt. This allowed it to shine on certain balanced teams, which usually could not switch into Mewtwo safely and were forced to sacrifice against it. Running DLD allowed them to better keep up with dangerous Mewtwo hyper offense teams, while not allowing opposing balanced teams to send in their Ferrothorn to match spikes. DLD's niche was a bit specific, but it was both unique and excellent at what it did, giving it a genuine place in the Ubers metagame and capping off a thoroughly eventful 5th generation for it. Deoxys Speed took a while to get going in Generation 5 OU. It was reasonable that it would get overlooked at the beginning, given the amount of crazy new powerful toys the generation brought. However, once the metagame settled, DOS showed once again how ridiculously good it was. Its Life Orb set was decent, but not really seen in high-level play. Instead, DOS was used for its ability to fuel various hyper offense teams. In addition to its numerous spiking sets later replicated exactly by Deoxys Defense, Deoxys Speed also effortlessly provided dual screens for already monster sweepers like Volcarona and Multiscale Dragonite, catapulting them into new realms of absurdity. It was even easier for them to set up and even more difficult for the opponent to actually revenge kill them, especially since DOS was so easily able to prevent opposing Stealth Rock. DOS and DLD teams were usually weatherless, but they were so good they were considered on par with weather teams. Most of the time, not using weather was suboptimal, but the Deoxys forms were one of the rare exceptions. So outstanding were they in their ability to command the game and set perfect conditions for their team right from turn 1. DOS was complained about for some time, but it wasn't until Excadrill and Thundurus were banned that it was seriously examined as overwhelming in its own right. With these bans, the OU tier had lost 2 of its best anti-offense options in Sandrush Excadrill's insane speed and Prankster Thundurus's priority Thunderwave, and DOS hyper offense became even more overwhelming, completely taking over the metagame. DOS effortlessly set the stage for the Scizor Rotom Wash Volt Turn combination to become even more absurd, turn Choice Band Terrakion into even more of an automatic KO machine, made Dragon Dance Dragonite downright uncounterable without a Quagsire, and so much more. As a result, sometime after Excadrill and Thundurus were removed from OU, so too was Deoxys Speed. It would wind up being the last Pokemon banned in Black and White 1. Deoxys Speed returned to Ubers and once again completely defined hyper offense. Despite being a dedicated lead, it was just like Deoxys Attack, and that team preview really let it act as a better lead. And this is in the generation where it was speculated that dedicated leads would cease to exist. DOS loved several of Generation 5's additions. It loved Rocky Helmet, which let it passively punish Rapid Spin and break Tyranitar's Focus Sash, meaning it was even less strapped for move slots. It loved the buff Magic Coat and Mental Herb that let it potentially gain edges in early game taunt wars with opposing DOS. It loved the buff Sleep mechanic that turned its favorite teammate Darkrai into even more of a nigh uncounterable monster. And most of all, it loved the monstrous new offensive threats it supported. Chief among them were many ferocious Arceus forms such as Electric Ground Fighting and of course Ghost, which provided a terrific spin blocking alternative to the still excellent Giratina origin. There were also others such as Scarf and Mixed Zekrom, the newly buffed Mewtwo and Rayquaza through the additions of Psystrike and V-Create respectively, respectively, and come Black and White 2, the metagame-defining Scarf Genesect. Even offbeat Pokemon like Magic Bounce Espeon didn't stop DOS. If anyone tried that, they might just find themselves on the bad end of a skill swap. For the second straight generation, Deoxys Speed Hyper Offense completely defined Ubers, and all in all, Generation 5 was once again a tremendous generation for Deoxys as a whole. Deoxys Normal was finally given a chance to truly shine in the very earliest stage of XYOU. It made the most of this chance because its time in OU didn't last long. It absolutely dominated the tier in the short time it was allowed. Its all-out offensive sets were absolutely absurd. DON destroyed most of the metagame through brute force alone, which was already an issue given how instantly fast it was. And even the few Pokemon that could check its combination of Psycho Boost and Superpower reliably, like Aegislash, Mandibuzz, and Sizzler, could be easily dispatched with coverage moves. Priority moves weren't even necessarily enough to finish DON off. It needed several rounds of Life Orb damage before it would fall into range for something like Mega Lucario's Bullet Punch, but even this wasn't enough for several reasons. One, several rounds of Life Orb damage meant DON was KOing something before these Pokemon even got a chance to switch in. Two, most priority attacks were incredibly easy to switch out of and absorb with another Pokemon. Even Talonflame's Brave Bird was coming off of a merely decent attack stat. Three, even Talonflame could be foiled because it had to be healthy enough to survive DON's own priority move, Extreme Speed. That was just the all-out attacker too. Focus Sash Stealth Rock leads were also devastating, dishing out a ton of damage if not a KO, while getting up rocks with ease. Alternatively, it could just throw down rocks and spikes and let the other insane teammates get to work. The newly buffed Defog couldn't stop it, as DON could easily threaten every Defogger. It just went to show DON had previously been Uber for a reason. When there was no Deoxys Attack around, Deoxys Normal was unbelievably threatening, and so for how incredibly overpowered it was, DON was swiftly banned from OU, alongside one of its common teammates, Blaziken. Sadly, it was once again not seen at all in Ubers for the same reason as Generation 5, but it now had pleasant memories of destroying OU to satiate it. The OU player base did not make the mistake of testing Deoxys Attack again, and thus left it to terrorize Ubers. Their DOA was once again absolutely brutal, both thoroughly enjoying the buff knockoff, whether as a Sash lead or a mid-game Life Orb nuke. DOA was a fixture on hyper offense teams that didn't run DOS. It took a while for it to take off thanks to the addition of annoyingly decent pseudo-checks Klefki and Yveltal, but DOA wound up reminding everyone why it was so dangerous. Klefki struggled to switch in, and it sacrificed itself to get a Thunder Wave off on DOA. It would no longer be alive to check DOA's teammate Xerneas, while DOA could punish the Stealth Rock weak Yveltal in some form by using anything besides Psycho Boost on the switch. Even a resisted knockoff would be useful to remove Yveltal's item on top of the Stealth Rock chip. Speaking of Psycho Boost, the move on Life Orb sets really took off in ORAS, as its obscene power and useful neutral coverage against popular Pokemon allowed Deoxys Attack to automatically delete a significant portion of the opponent's team. Even the best Pokemon in the tier, like Primal Groudon, Mega Salamence, Xerneas, Primal Kyogre, Mega Gengar, and most Arceus forms, had to run from it, and switch-ins were in short supply, as Klefki, Yveltal, and Dialga were absolutely pounded by Life Orb superpower, while the Lati twins were destroyed by knockoff. DOA ripped through offense, balance, and stall alike, in addition to its naturally huge speed, giving it the jump on even fast Pokemon such as Mewtwo and its two new Mega Evolutions. It could even help deal with the few faster Pokemon, like boosted Mega Ment or Xerneas with Life Orb Extreme Speed, which also helped it finish off weakened Yveltal, non-first turn Mega Kangaskhan, or Extreme Killer Arceus, beating them to the punch on Sucker Punch or Arceus' own Extreme Speed, respectively. DOA could potentially play mind games with Yveltal. If they were in a situation where Yveltal couldn't Roost or Dark Pulse because it would be KO'd by Superpower or Ice Beam, DOA could bypass its need to Sucker Punch or get KO'd by Extreme Speeding, which would 2-hit KO from such a range and cause Sucker Punch to fail. It was one of the many ways in which Deoxys Attack was yet again one of the most threatening Pokemon around, this time in the most powerful Uber tier yet. And now we'll momentarily group Deoxys Defense and Deoxys Speed together, as they both started in OU and function largely the same. Many players thought their hazard stacking ways would be kept in check by Defog, but those players thought wrong. DLD paired up with Bisharp, whose Defiant ability activated thanks to Defog's side effect of lowering the opponent's evasion. This meant any Defog attempt gave Bisharp a free Swords Dance, which was especially dangerous given Bisharp's huge attack, buff knockoff, and Steel no longer resisting Dark. The Deal Sharp combination rocked OU, and was especially dangerous not just because Bisharp was such a great Pokemon in general, but because Deoxys didn't even need it to handle Defog. They could just taunt the Defog attempt and continue stacking their hazards, providing the basis of their fierce offensive teammates like Greninja and Mega Mawile to grab momentum and easily run away with the game. Deoxys Deoxys Speed's Life Orb set also returned with a vengeance. It posed a massive offensive threat in its own right, as it was immensely difficult to switch into for offensive teams thanks to its good power and coverage alongside unmatched speed. It could abuse the switches if forced to set up Stealth Rock, playing similarly to Sash Stealth Rock Deoxys Normal. This offensive capability, in addition to its relentless hazard stacking, was what led Deoxys Speed to be tested alongside Genesect and Mega Lucario. However, those two received the boot, while DOS was not considered to be overwhelming by the player base, at least not yet. In this moment, Deoxys Speed was like Michael Jordan. It took this personally. Galvanized by this slight upon the brokenness it prided itself on, DOS continued down the MJ path, proving why it was the best, determined on hammering into the player base the fact that it had no business being OU, as did Deoxys Defense alongside it. The two continued along their merry way for a while longer until the player base realized their mistake and decided enough was enough. Both Deoxys forms were suspected together, and at long last, the lesson was learned. Not only were they banned, they have not returned to OU in any capacity since. Several notable players proclaiming Deoxys' brokenness in OU to be as inherent a trait to it as its psychic typing swore to fight tooth and nail against any potential retesting of any form in the future, and they have been successful. Deoxys Defense was sadly not too great in Ubers. Its lack of useful resistances meant it didn't have much of a defensive niche in a metagame with such powerful stab attack. It couldn't reliably stomach all the Precipice Blades, Rain boosted Origin Pulses, Arrow Late Double Edges, and Fairy Aura boosted Moonblast flying around, to say nothing of the super effective stab attacks aimed at it from every corner by Darkrai, Yveltal, Mega Gengar, and Ghost Arceus, even before Oraz arrived. DOD couldn't even afford to run Taunt, as it was obligated to run Skill Swap to not be rendered completely useless by Mega Sableye and Mega Diancie. It was basically outclassed as a spiker by Klefki, who, in addition to handling both magic bouncers better, packed amazing traits in Prankster Thunderwave and valuable resist by virtue of its Steel Fairy typing, making it one of the most consistent performers in the tier. Still, DOD had a good Generation 6 overall. It had gotten banned alongside DOS for the first time, finally recognized as being just as good instead of being thought of as a DOS replacement. Once again, Deoxys Speed defined hyper offense in Ubers from day one. The popularity of bulky Arceus forms packing a buff to Fog was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, which DOS teams were quickly designed to thwart. Not only did DOS completely shut it down with Taunt, its favorite partner Darkrai would, once again, come in early game, taking advantage of the momentum set by DOS. Something would then be shut down by Dark Void, and the snowball would begin rolling down the hill. Darkrai could even pack Taunt itself to really strangle bulky teams trying to clear the hazards, as could the vicious Mega Gengar. It wasn't just directly preventing the Fog through Sleep and Taunt either. As always, the heavy swinging offensive momentum DOS set in motion for the strongest Pokemon in the game was often enough to overwhelm teams if planned correctly, as was done through Team Preview. It was difficult to get a defog off when Xerneas was threatening to Geomancy or Arceus was threatening to Swords Dance. The playstyle became even more vicious in Oraz once Primal Groudon and Mega Salamence joined the fray. The standard Deoxys Speed hyper offense with Darkrai, Xerneas, Primal Groudon, Mega Salamence, and Extreme Killer Arceus became known to many as the so-called quote-unquote default team in the tier because it wasn't just threatening, but immensely reliable in doing so even if one knew it was coming. There were of course adaptations made in response to the playstyle, but as always, DOS could adapt right back. Plus, DOS teams didn't have to be the standard. There was a host of vicious threats just waiting to capitalize on DOS's momentum. Once again, Deoxys Speed was an enormous, influential part of Ubers. The 6th generation was possibly the most eventful for Deoxys as a whole, as even Deoxys Normal finally got to show its stuff. As Generation 7 did not test a single Deoxys form in OU, Deoxys Normal saw no usage throughout the generation, outclassed as it was always by Deoxys Attack. DOA was absolutely vicious in early Sun and Moon, especially if used alongside Tapu Lele, whose Psychic Terrain not only boosted Deoxys Attack's Psycho Boost to power levels incomprehensible to the human mind, but also brought the absolutely incredible benefit of blocking opposing priority moves. DOA was so ridiculous under Psychic Terrain that Lele often used Terrain Extended to prolong the terror. Its power was so absurd. Not only did it destroy max HP variants of Arceus, Xerneas, and Primal Kyogre, but it even did well over 50% to specially defensive Magearna. Of course, even a Life Orb Psychic Terrain boosted Psycho Boost still did 0% to Dark types, and DOA had to contend with not just Yveltal, but Alolan Muck. However, its Life Orb superpower still put quite a charge in Alolan Muck, who struggled to take 2 with Stealth Rock and couldn't even Shadow Sneak if Psychic Terrain was up. In a similar vein, Yveltal couldn't even Sucker Punch DOA if psychic terrain was up, meaning it had to stay out of Ice Beam range. DOA was an utterly monstrous threat in Sun and Moon, and sadly, this did not last into Ultra Sun and Moon. The addition of Necrozma Duskmane was a devastating blow as it switched into DOA even in psychic terrain. DOA would have to run Dark Pulse to hurt NDM, but it struggled to fit it into its move pool, and it was heavily prediction reliant, not to mention it wouldn't even 2-hit KO specially defensive variants. DOA didn't become completely unviable, but for the first time ever, it fell off hard. It had to compete with Mega Mewtwo Y, who packed a powerful Fire Blast for NDM as well as Magearna, and also had the significant benefit of being able to take one of their moves in return. DOA also had to contend with Necrozma in another way. Ultra Necrozma was absolutely insane, and it was also a terrifying offensive psychic type. And so Deoxys Attack was tough to get use out of consistently, and this was the sad, sudden end of an era. Deoxys Defense was once again completely unusable in Ubers. It was utterly outclassed by every other spiker. Pure bulk doesn't matter much if you don't have the resist to back it up, as evidenced by all of Ferrothorn, Skarmory, and Klefki being far more useful against the slew of threats in Ubers than DOD could hope to be. It just couldn't find any sort of niche at all. Deoxys Speed was once again the face of standard hyper offense in early Sun and Moon. As always, it reliably led off and laid the groundwork for the relentless assault of Xerneas, Primal Groudon, and friends. It tended to lean towards setting up screens more than spikes, but either way, it got the job done beautifully. In every generation, there is offensive power creep, and DOS benefits from its teammates constantly becoming more dangerous, just as they appreciated setting the momentum for them. In Gen 7, the threats DOS was supporting were more dangerous than ever thanks to the addition of Z-moves, as well as improved Mega Speed mechanics. And of course, there were new threats like Lunala. There were some nerfs as well. Mega Salamence wasn't as strong as the previous generation thanks to Aerolite weakening its boost, while Darkrai had become completely unviable thanks to the Dark Void nerf. However, Deoxys Speed persisted through the loss of its longtime favorite partner, until Ultra Sun and Moon came out and gave defog to everything. It suddenly became incredibly easy to find opportunities to get rocks off. Battles became more gradual, more about trying to repeatedly set up and eventually maintain rocks in extended wars of attrition. This, of course, was completely antithetical to the setup and die approach of Deoxys Speed. Even hyper offense teams needed some semblance of longevity to not get outclassed by all the bulky teams. It became much easier to slap Stealth Rock on Primal Groudon or the newly added Necrozma Duskmane, as they were naturally bulky and were massive offensive threats. It usually wasn't a good idea to dedicate a slot solely to getting up hazards. Players that wanted a suicide Stealth Rock lead usually went with Excadrill, whose utility far surpassed that of DOS. Excadrill wasn't much in the way of longevity, but it was far more effective as an aggressive rocker. Mold Breaker allowed it to instantly bypass Mega Sableye Magic Bounce, and Stab Earthquake allowed it to threaten Primal Groudon and Necrozma Duskmane, potentially giving it an early Stealth Rock advantage. DOS wasn't rendered completely unviable or anything, but its usage dropped significantly, as it was quite difficult to make work consistently. Sad as it was, the classic combination of Deoxys Speed and Darkrai had finally come to the end of the road in Generation 7, and the entirety of Deoxys did once Ultra Sun and Moon came around. As for the first time in history, Deoxys Attack wasn't one of the most threatening Pokemon in the game. Halfway through the generation, Deoxys A went from being Johnny Cash in his prime to Johnny Cash singing Hurt. We can imagine little sadder than the greatest offensive Pokemon in the game no longer being able to hack it. And that's it. So how good was Deoxys actually? Well, for one thing, it's so good that it outclasses itself. Deoxys Normal would be a great Pokemon if it wasn't so utterly outdone by Deoxys Attack. And speaking of Deoxys forms performing similarly, Defense and Speed have filled similar hazard stacking lead roles during their various tenures in OU. The Deoxys forms are generally a testament to the power of spikes across metagames. And if there's one thing consistent about the Deoxys form's competitive history, it's the fact that no form has ever been able to stay in OU. It has been tried multiple times, and every time they have been banned. The same thing happened when Deoxys D was in UU, because yeah, Deoxys D was in UU. Gen 5 was a crazy time. Speaking of crazy times, Sun and Moon ended the long-term reign of Deoxys Speed, and Ultra Sun and Moon did the same for even the mighty Deoxys Attack, the pinnacle of pure offense. Hopefully, if the Deoxys forms return in Generation 8, they will be given some sort of buff so they can reclaim their past glory. The removal of Megas will already help in that regard, but it would be really, really great to see Deoxys A with moves like Close Combat, Expanding Force, and just for the fun of it, V-Create. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Deoxys? If it comes back to Gen 8, what would you give it? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. and follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.